Caroline Sinclair pressed her hands flat against the cold window pane and told herself she would not cry. Not tonight. Not over a debt she hadn't made, a game she hadn't played, or a man she had never met. A man who now held the entire shape of her future in his hands. She had done nothing wrong, and yet everything was about to be taken from her anyway. If you've ever been punished for someone else's choices, stay with me. Subscribe, follow this story all the way through, and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this goes. The night Edward Sinclair lost everything, he didn't scream. He didn't overturn the table, or curse God, or reach for the nearest bottle of whiskey. The Lord knows the bottle was right there. He simply sat back in his chair, folded his hands on the green felt, and stared at the cards like a man watching the last light leave a dying fire. Quiet. Still. Already gone somewhere inside himself. The private gaming room at Hargrove's Club smelled like pipe smoke and old money. Two things Edward Sinclair had once possessed in abundance and now claimed only in memory. The candelabras burned low. The other men at the table had gone tight-shouldered and careful, the way men do when they sense that something irreversible is about to happen, and they don't want to be standing too close to it. Across the table, Richard Ashford, the Duke of Ashford, leaned back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who had never once in his life worried about money. He was 53 years old, silver-haired, and had the kind of face that had once been handsome and had since become something harder and less forgiving. He tapped one long finger against the edge of the table. Slow, patient, the way a cat taps a trapped mouse. "Well, Sinclair," Ashford said. His voice was smooth, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I believe that concludes our evening." Edward didn't answer right away. He was looking at the pile in the center of the table. What was left of it anyway. The number swimming somewhere in the back of his skull was so large it had stopped feeling like a real thing. It had become abstract, like a bad dream you keep trying to wake up from and can't. "I can pay," Edward said. "You cannot," Ashford replied, pleasantly. "Give me 30 days, Edward." Ashford picked up his glass and swirled it slowly. "We have been friends for a great many years. I say that with all the warmth I genuinely possess. And it is precisely because of that warmth that I am going to offer you something instead of simply calling in your notes first thing tomorrow morning and letting the lawyers strip your townhouse down to the floorboards." He set the glass down. "So listen carefully." The other men at the table found sudden, intense interest in their own cards, and their own hands, and their own shoes. Nobody looked up. "Your debts to me total $11,000, Ashford said. He let that number sit in the air, like a stone dropped into still water. "Your estate, such as it remains, is worth perhaps 4. Your accounts, I've had them reviewed, naturally, hold less than 200. He tilted his head. "You have one asset remaining that I have not yet quantified." Edward's jaw tightened. "I have no assets remaining, Richard." "You have a daughter." The room went so quiet that the pop and hiss of the candle wax was audible. Edward Sinclair was not a violent man. He had never been a violent man. But something moved across his face in that moment. A flicker, hot and brief, before the stillness closed back over it. He said very quietly, "I beg your pardon." "Miss Caroline Sinclair." Ashford's tone hadn't changed. He might have been discussing a parcel of land in Connecticut. 23 years old, well-educated, well-mannered. I've seen her at the Whitmore Assembly 2 seasons running. She's remarkable, frankly. I have been a widower for 6 years, as you know. My children are grown. I have a great deal of house and not enough life in it." He opened his hands, the picture of reasonableness. "Marry her to me, and your debts disappear. Every note, every obligation, gone. Your townhouse remains yours. Your family name remains clean. You walk out of this room a free man." Edward's hands, still flat on the table, curled slowly inward. "She is not," he said, "a card to be played." "No," Ashford agreed. "She is a solution. There's a difference. She is my daughter." Which is precisely why this offer is merciful, rather than merely transactional. Ashford smiled, not unkindly, and that was somehow the worst part. "Consider the alternative, Edward. Bankruptcy proceedings. Your name in the papers. Your wife's family notified. Caroline herself. Where does she go? What does she do? The market for a ruined gentleman's daughter is not a generous one." He spread his hands. "I am offering the girl a title, a great house, financial security for the remainder of her life, and a husband who has no intention of being unkind to her. I'd call that a better hand than the one she currently holds." No one at the table breathed. Edward Sinclair closed his eyes. He was 51 years old. He had made bad investments and worse decisions and had told himself, all the way down, that the bottom would never actually come. And now it had come. And it looked like Richard Ashford's patient, reasonable face on the other side of a card table. And the only currency he had left was his daughter's life. He opened his mouth, and that was when the door opened. He came in the way a man enters a room when he doesn't feel the need to explain himself, without rushing, without announcement, with a kind of authority that had nothing to do with noise. He was perhaps 35, broad-shouldered, dark-coated, and he moved through the space between the door and the table with the unhurried confidence of someone who had made decisions in harder rooms than this. He had dark hair and darker eyes, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from something that didn't yield easily. Maximilian Kingsley. Even Ashford went slightly still, which told you something. "Kingsley," Ashford said after a moment. His pleasantness didn't slip, but it recalibrated. "This is a private game." "It was," Maximilian said. He didn't look at Ashford yet. He was looking at Edward, and what was in his face wasn't pity exactly. It was something quieter and more serious than pity. "I've been standing in the hall long enough to understand the terms being offered, Your Grace." Now he looked at Ashford. "I'm here to change them." Ashford set down his glass. "You are not part of this arrangement." "I am now." Maximilian pulled out the empty chair at the end of the table and sat down with the ease of a man settling in for a long conversation. He folded his hands. "Sinclair's debts to you, 11,000, as I understand it?" Edward stared at him. "Kingsley, what in God's name—" 11,000, Maximilian confirmed, as though Edward hadn't spoken. He was still looking at Ashford. "I'll pay it. Tonight, if you'd like. Bank draft certified. Before the week is out." The room tilted on its axis. Ashford's expression didn't change much, but something moved behind his eyes. A recalculation, rapid and careful. "And what," he said slowly, "do you want in return?" "The same thing you want," Maximilian said. "Miss Sinclair's hand." Edward shot to his feet. His chair scraped back hard against the floor. "Now just a damn minute! Sit down, Edward." Maximilian's voice was quiet, but it landed like a hand on a shoulder, firm and unarguable. Something in Edward's knees obeyed before the rest of him caught up, and he sank, slowly, back into his chair. Maximilian gave him a look, direct even, with something in it that Edward couldn't quite name. Not contempt, something more careful than that. "I know how this sounds. Hear me out." "You cannot—" Edward's voice cracked. He pressed his mouth shut, jaw working. "She is not— This is not—" "This is not what you imagined your life would look like," Maximilian said, quietly. "I know that. I know it better than you think." He turned back to Ashford. "You want the girl for reasons that I am confident Miss Sinclair herself would find disagreeable. I want her for reasons that, if you'd care to examine them honestly, are rather different." "And what reasons might those be?" Ashford asked. His voice had gone careful. Maximilian looked at him for a long moment. "She deserves better than what this table has on offer from you, Your Grace. That's reason enough." It wasn't a pretty speech. It wasn't meant to be. It was the kind of thing a man says when he means it and doesn't particularly care whether the room finds it convincing. Ashford studied him. "You're offering $11,000 on behalf of a girl you've, what, seen at a party?" "I've done my research," Maximilian said, simply. "That is not a romantic answer, Kingsley." "No," Maximilian agreed. "It isn't. But romance isn't what's being negotiated here, is it?" He glanced at Edward, then back. "What's being negotiated is a woman's future, and I intend that future to be something she can live with." The clock on the mantel ticked. Once. Twice. Ashford picked up his glass again and turned it slowly in his fingers. The calculation happening behind his eyes was almost visible. $11,000 was $11,000, and Ashford, for all his pleasantness, was at his core a man who understood ledgers. Whatever else he'd wanted from this arrangement, whatever complicated, personal interest he had in Edward Sinclair's daughter, it had always been transactional. Maximilian Kingsley was offering him the transaction without the complication. "You'll pay the full sum," Ashford said, "within the week. And Sinclair's notes, all of them, are returned. Destroyed, if you prefer. Witnessed." Another long silence. Then Ashford set down his glass, pushed back his chair, and stood. He buttoned his coat with the careful precision of a man who had gotten what he came for, even if it wasn't precisely in the form he'd expected. "Very well," he said. He looked at Edward, who hadn't moved, who looked like a man sitting in the wreckage of something and not yet sure whether the fire had gone out. "You should count yourself fortunate, Sinclair, in more ways than one." He left without ceremony. The other men at the table followed within moments, filing out with a quiet speed of people who know they've witnessed something they shouldn't repeat too widely. And then it was just the two of them, Edward Sinclair and Maximilian Kingsley, in a room full of dying candlelight and pipe smoke, and the ghost of a disaster that had been, somehow, interrupted. Edward looked at Maximilian for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Why?" Maximilian was quiet. He seemed to be choosing something. Not the words exactly, but the angle of honesty he was willing to commit to. "Because Ashford is not a man Miss Sinclair should be tied to, and because you had no other way out." He paused. "And because I am in a position to offer one. You don't know my daughter." "No," Maximilian said. "I don't." "Then what in God's name gives you the right?" "Nothing," Maximilian said. And he said it straight, without apology or deflection. "Nothing gives me the right." "But rights don't much matter in a room like this, Sinclair. What matters is what happens next. And what happens next is that your daughter is either Ashford's wife or she's given the choice of whether to become mine. And I intend for it to be a choice, a real one, not a card play." He stood. "I won't force anything. I'll come to your home. I'll ask her myself. She can say no, and I'll honor it, and we'll find some other way to settle the debt. But she deserves to be in that room when the question is asked, not outside it." Edward stared at him. His eyes were red at the edges, from the cigar smoke maybe, or from something else entirely. "You're a strange man, Kingsley." "I've been called worse," Maximilian said. He picked up his hat from the side table. "I'll call tomorrow at 2 o'clock, if that suits." He left Edward Sinclair sitting alone in the wreckage of his evening, the smell of old money and smoke drifting through the emptied room, the candles burning lower and lower toward nothing. Across the city, in the Sinclair townhouse on a quiet street that had once felt elegant and now felt merely tired, Caroline Sinclair was awake. She hadn't been able to sleep. She hadn't been able to sleep for 3 weeks, if she was being honest. Not since she'd found the first letter, the one from the solicitor, tucked badly behind the clock on her father's desk, its language careful and precise and devastating. She hadn't told her father she'd found it. She hadn't told anyone. She sat in the chair by her window, with her knees drawn up and her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, looking out at the street below, where the gas lamps made pale halos in the dark. She was 23 years old, and she was not a foolish person. She had always known the household accounts were thin. She had always known her father had a weakness for cards, the same way some men have a weakness for drink. Not ruinous in good years, catastrophic in bad ones. This had been a very bad year. She heard the front door an hour before she expected it. Her father's step on the stair, heavier than usual, slower, the step of a man carrying something invisible and enormous. She heard him stop outside her door. She heard him put his hand against it, just resting there, not knocking. She waited. He didn't knock. After a long moment, his steps continued down the hall, and his bedroom door opened and closed, and the house was quiet again. Caroline pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window. He'd lost. She knew it the way you know certain things before anyone tells you. In the particular quality of the silence, in the weight of the footstep, in the way a door closes when the person on the other side of it has nothing left. She didn't cry. She sat there for a long time and thought about what she knew and what she didn't know, and what was going to happen now. She thought about the house, this house, her mother's house, with its faded curtains and its creaking third stair, and the garden her mother had loved, and that Caroline still tended stubbornly every spring. She thought about what bankruptcy looked like in practice. She thought about the faces of the women she knew, the way they would compose themselves into sympathy and feel relief underneath it. Relief that it was the Sinclairs and not themselves. She thought about the letter from the solicitor, the number in it, the word irredeemable. She was still there, her forehead against the glass, when the gray light began to come up at the edge of the sky. She did not know, sitting in that chair, that a man she had never met had just purchased the right to ask her a question. She did not know his name or his face, or that he had stood in a private gaming room 2 miles across the city and said, quietly and without fanfare, that she deserved to be in the room when the question was asked. She didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was that her father would come to her in the morning, that his face would carry something she had never seen on it before, and she wasn't sure she was ready to see. That whatever he told her, she would have to find some way to stand inside it without falling. She had always been good at that, standing inside hard things without falling. She'd had practice enough. The gray light strengthened. The street below began to wake. Somewhere down the block, a cart horse clopped past on the cobblestones, and a delivery boy called out something cheerful to a shopkeeper, and the ordinary machinery of the morning cranked itself forward, indifferent to the particular disaster of the Sinclair household. Caroline watched it all from the window, and she waited for her father's step on the stair. He came to her at 8:30. She had dressed by then, put her hair up, made herself as composed as she knew how to be. She was sitting at the small writing desk in her room when he knocked, and she said, "Come in." And he came in, and she saw his face, and she understood immediately that whatever she had imagined last night in the dark, the reality was going to be something different, something worse. "Papa?" she said, carefully. "Caroline." His voice was rough. He hadn't slept either. She could see it in the redness around his eyes, the stiffness in his jaw, the way he stood just inside the door, as though he hadn't quite decided whether he had the right to be there. "I need to tell you something." "Sit down," she said. "Please." He sat on the edge of her bed, the way a man sits when he doesn't trust his own legs. She turned her chair toward him and folded her hands in her lap and kept her face as quiet as she could manage. He told her, not all of it, not Ashford's offer, not in those words, not the full, naked horror of what had been proposed across that table. But enough. The debts, the game, the loss. He stumbled over the numbers, and she let him stumble without interrupting, because she already knew the broad strokes, and what she needed now was to hear the ending. "There was a man," he said finally, "named Kingsley, Maximilian Kingsley. You may have heard of him." She had. Everyone in New York society had, more or less. The name carried a particular weight. Money, yes, but not the old, comfortable, inherited kind. The kind that had been made hard and fast, and with the kind of decisions that didn't leave room for sentiment. His father had built something, she thought, and Maximilian had expanded it. And the result was a name that appeared in financial conversations and occasionally in gossip columns, but rarely, she had always thought, in anything you'd call a personal story. "He's offered to settle the debts," her father said. "All of them." Caroline waited. "In return for... he wants..." Her father stopped. His hands were shaking slightly on his knees. He looked at them like they belonged to someone else. "He wants to marry you, Caroline. He says he'll come tomorrow and ask you himself. He said it would be your choice." A short, painful pause. "He said you deserved to be in the room when the question was asked." The silence stretched. "Papa," Caroline said. "I know," he said quickly. "I know. I know what this sounds like. I know what I've done. I know you didn't... I never meant for it to come to this. You have to believe that. I never..." His voice broke, badly, and he pressed one hand over his mouth and looked away. Caroline stood. She crossed the small space between them and sat beside him on the bed, and took his shaking hands in both of hers and held them still. She didn't say, "It's all right," because it wasn't. She didn't say, "I forgive you," because she hadn't decided that yet. What she said, after a moment, was very quiet. "Tell me what this man is like." Her father looked at her. His eyes were wet. "I don't know him well. I know his reputation. He's hard, they say. Uncompromising. But tonight..." He paused, and something moved in his face that she couldn't quite read. "Tonight he walked into that room and he changed the terms, Caroline. He didn't have to. There was nothing in it for him, no obvious angle, no... He said you deserved better than what was being offered." He shook his head slowly. "I don't know what that makes him. I truly don't." Caroline looked down at their joined hands. Her father's hands, still strong, despite everything, despite all the ways they'd failed to hold what they should have held. "He's coming at 2:00, she said. "Yes." She nodded once. "Slow and deliberate. The way you move when you're making yourself do something that you haven't finished being afraid of yet." "Then I'll be here at 2:00, she said. and I'll hear what he has to say." She lifted her chin and looked at the wall in front of her, at the faded paper with its pattern of small blue flowers that she had woken up looking at every morning for 23 years. The house was quiet around her. The garden outside waited, brown and winter bare, for a spring that was still weeks away. She was not a card to be played. She knew that. She had always known that. But she was also a practical woman, living in a world that was not, in the end, particularly interested in her feelings about it. And somewhere across this city, a man she had never met had done something tonight that she could not yet explain, had stood in a room full of men with money and power, and had said, quietly, that she deserved to be in the room when the question was asked. She was going to be in that room, and she was going to decide for herself. She told herself she wasn't nervous. She repeated it 3 times while she pinned her hair, twice more while she straightened the collar of her dress, and one final time while she stood outside the drawing room door with her hand on the frame and her heart doing something erratic and undignified in her chest. She was not nervous. She was prepared. There was a considerable difference, and she intended to hold on to it. She pushed the door open and walked in. He was standing near the fireplace, not sitting, not pacing, just standing with his hands clasped behind his back and his attention on the middle distance, the way a man stands when he is comfortable enough in his own mind that he doesn't need to fill the silence with movement. He turned when she came in. He was taller than she'd expected, broader. The description she'd assembled from social gossip and careful observation across crowded rooms hadn't quite captured the particular quality of his stillness, the way he took up space without effort, the way his eyes moved to her face and stayed there, direct and unhurried. "Miss Sinclair," he said. "Mr. Kingsley." She kept her voice level. She crossed to the chair nearest the window and sat without being asked, and folded her hands in her lap. "I believe you know why you're here. I'd prefer we skip any portion of this conversation that doesn't require us to say the actual words." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, something adjacent to it. "Your father said you were direct." "My father says a great many things. Not all of them are useful." She met his eyes. "You paid $11,000 last night. That's a considerable sum to spend on a woman you've never spoken to." "It is," he agreed. He didn't apologize for it. "Then I'd like to know why." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man stalling, but the silence of a man who is deciding how much truth to commit to. He sat down across from her, leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "Because Ashford is not a man you should spend your life with," he said. "And because the alternative, which was you being traded across a card table by your father without anyone asking your opinion, struck me as wrong in a way I wasn't willing to simply walk past." Caroline looked at him. "That's a moral argument," she said. "Most men in your position would offer a practical one." "I have practical ones as well, if you'd prefer." "I'd prefer both." He almost smiled at that. "Practically, I'm 36 years old. I have a large house that I rattle around in, and a business that takes up more of my time than is probably healthy, and very few people in my life who say what they actually mean. I need a wife, in the functional sense, for reasons that are not romantic but are genuine." He paused. "And morally, I have seen what men like Ashford do with women who have no one to speak for them. I have seen it up close, Miss Sinclair, in ways that made a permanent impression on my thinking. I was not willing to stand in the hall of Hargrove's club and let that happen to someone else." The fire crackled. She studied his face for the kind of smoothness that would tell her he was performing something, and she didn't find it. What she found instead was harder to categorize. Something weathered and careful. A man who had decided very deliberately what he was willing to say, and was saying only that. "This is not," she said slowly, "a love match." "No," he said, "it isn't. I won't pretend otherwise." "You're offering me security and your name and the settling of my father's debts." "Yes." "And in return?" He met her eyes. "A real marriage, not a performance. I won't ask you to be something you're not. I won't ask you to smile prettily at dinner parties, or pretend to opinions you don't hold, or make yourself smaller so that I feel larger. What I would ask is honesty, partnership, and a genuine effort at something that could, in time, be more than a transaction." He paused. "I make no promises about what it becomes, but I make every promise about what it starts as." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside in the hall, she could hear her father's step, the slow, restless pace of a man trying very hard not to press his ear to the door. "You could have anyone," she said. "A woman with money of her own. A family without scandal attached to it. Why take on our mess, Mr. Kingsley? What is it you actually want from this?" He looked at her for a beat longer than was comfortable. "I want," he said carefully, "a woman who will tell me to my face what she's thinking, who won't be cowed by money or position or the fact that I'm standing between her and ruin." He held her gaze. "You walked into this room and told me to skip the pleasantries. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Something moved in her chest that she didn't entirely trust. "I need time," she said. "I won't give you an answer today." "I wouldn't take one today," he replied. She looked up. "Take a week," he said. "Talk to your father. Think it through. I'll send no pressure and no reminders. If your answer is no, the debt remains settled. I won't claw it back. You have my word on that. In writing, if you want it." She stared at him. "You'd pay $11,000 for a conversation?" "I'd pay $11,000 to know that whatever answer you give me was made freely." He stood, picked up his hat from the side table. "There's a difference between a marriage and a surrender, Miss Sinclair. I'm asking for the first one. I won't accept the second." He left before she could find an answer to that. She sat in the chair for a long time after the front door closed, listening to her father's steps stop outside the drawing room, and then, slowly, retreat. She pressed her palms flat on her knees and stared at the far wall, and tried to sort through what she was feeling into something coherent. She couldn't. What she was left with, underneath the fear and the pride and the practical calculation, was one thing she hadn't expected to feel at all. A quiet, stubborn, inconvenient curiosity about a man who had walked into a room full of power and spent his own money to give her a choice. That was not nothing. She just wasn't sure yet what it was. She went upstairs and closed her bedroom door and sat on the edge of her bed and let herself, finally, be afraid. Not of Maximilian Kingsley. Not exactly. Not anymore. Afraid of what it meant to say yes. Afraid of what it cost to say no. Afraid of the long corridor of her future opening in two directions at once, and the knowledge that whichever door she walked through, she could not come back. Her mother had died when Caroline was 14. What she remembered most was not the grief, which had been enormous, but the way her mother had faced the hard things. Quietly, without drama, with a particular set to her jaw that said, "I did not choose this, but I am here, and I intend to manage it." Caroline had spent 9 years trying to inherit that quality. She wasn't sure she'd succeeded. But she knew what her mother would have said, standing in this room, looking at these two doors. She would have said, "Pick the one where you remain yourself." Caroline lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and decided, She would sleep on it. She would sleep on it for a week, as he'd offered. And she would be deliberate and careful, and she would not let herself be rushed by fear or sentiment, or the particular weight of a pair of dark, direct eyes that had looked at her across a drawing room and seen someone worth looking at. She was asleep inside 10 minutes, for the first time in 3 weeks. She did not tell her father about the conversation in any detail. She told him that she needed a week to think, and he nodded, silent, with something that might have been relief or shame, or both, braided together, and he didn't push her. For 3 days they moved through the house like two people being very careful with each other, polite, cautious, giving wide berth to the enormous thing that sat between them, and that neither of them was yet ready to examine directly. On the 4th day, her father's older sister came to call. Aunt Margaret Sinclair was 62 years old, straight-backed as a fence post, and possessed of opinions that she distributed freely and without apology. She arrived in the afternoon without a letter of advance notice, which was her habit, and she seated herself in the good chair in the parlor and accepted a cup of tea with the manner of a general accepting a report from the field. "I've heard," she said, looking at Caroline over the rim of her cup. "I assumed you had," Caroline said. "Your father has made a spectacular fool of himself." "Aunt Margaret." "No." Margaret set down her cup with a decisive click. "He is my brother, and I love him dearly, and he has made a spectacular fool of himself. And we can either acknowledge that plainly and move forward, or we can tiptoe around it until it molds, and I have no patience for molding." She fixed Caroline with eyes that had never, in 62 years, permitted themselves the luxury of softness. "Now, tell me about Kingsley." Caroline looked at her aunt for a long moment. Then she told her, all of it, including the parts she hadn't told her father, including the conversation in the drawing room, and the quiet weight of his voice, and the thing he'd said about surrender versus marriage. Margaret listened without interrupting. This alone was unusual enough that Caroline paid attention to it. When she finished, her aunt was quiet for a moment, turning her cup in her hands. "He said he wouldn't take the debt back if you refused." "Yes." "In writing." "He offered it." Margaret set the cup down again. "Caroline, I have lived in this city for 62 years. I have watched women marry for love and end up trapped in houses with men who turned out to be something other than advertised. I have watched women marry for money and find, to their surprise, that money buys a great deal more peace than they expected. And I have watched a very small number of women marry for something in between. Not love exactly, and not calculation exactly, but some honest middle ground where both people knew the terms going in and honored them." She looked at her niece. "That last category is the rarest. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "I think so," Caroline said. "He offered you a choice," Margaret said. "That is not nothing, girl. That is not a small thing, in this world, in this year, in the particular circumstances of your family. Most men in his position would have sent a solicitor with a contract." "He came himself." "He came himself," Margaret repeated. "And he told you what he wanted and what he wouldn't accept, and he gave you a week." She picked up her cup again. "I am not telling you to say yes. I'm telling you to think clearly about what yes and no actually mean in the world you're living in. Not the world you'd like to be living in, the actual one." That evening, Caroline sat at the writing desk in her room with a blank page in front of her and a pen she didn't use. She had spent 4 days turning the decision over in her mind, like a stone she was looking for cracks in, and she had found plenty of cracks. She'd found fear and pride and the stubborn romantic part of herself that wanted to object loudly to the entire premise. What she hadn't found was a better option. She thought about what Ashford had proposed and felt something cold move through her. She thought about what Maximilian had countered with and felt something else. Something less comfortable than cold. Something she was reluctant to name. She thought about the word surrender. And she thought about the word partnership. And she thought about what her mother's jaw had looked like when she said it. Then she put down the pen and went to find her father. He was in his study, not working. There was nothing in front of him. No papers, no book, just his hands folded on the desk and his eyes on the middle distance. He looked up when she came in. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been waiting for something without knowing how to ask for it. "Papa," she said. She sat down across from him. "I need you to tell me the truth about something." "Carolyn." Not an apology, not an explanation. The truth. She held his eyes. "If I say no to Kingsley, if I refuse and his money goes away, what actually happens to this family?" Her father was quiet for a long time. His hands tightened on the desk. "We lose the house," he said. His voice was flat and careful, the voice of a man reading from something terrible. "The creditors move quickly once the notes are called. The furniture, the accounts, everything's sold. Your mother's china." He paused. "I would likely be taken to court. My name in the papers." He looked at her. "And you? I can't protect you from the social consequences, Caroline. I wish I could tell you otherwise." She nodded. She'd known most of this. Hearing it said plainly was different from knowing it, but she'd expected that. "And if I say yes?" she said. He opened his hands. "The debts are gone. The house is yours. Kingsley's, technically, but yours to live in if you choose. Your mother's china stays on the shelf." He looked at her with the red-edged eyes of a man who had not slept a full night in weeks. "And I live with what I've done for the rest of my life." "Yes," she said, "you do." She paused, and then, because she loved him, and because it was true, and because she thought they both needed her to say it plainly, "I'm not marrying him for you, Papa. If I do this, it's because I've looked at the options clearly and decided it's the one I can live with. Not for you, for me." Her father's breath came out in a long, unsteady line. "Of course," he said quietly. "Of course it is." She stood. She went to the door, and then she stopped. She didn't look back when she said the next thing. She said it to the doorframe, to the hall beyond, to the version of her future that was waiting somewhere on the other side of a decision she hadn't fully made yet. "He said there's a difference between a marriage and a surrender," she said, "and that he'd ask for the first one." A short pause. "I think I believe him." She went upstairs without waiting for her father to answer. That night, the 5th night of her week, she wrote a letter. Not to Maximilian Kingsley, not yet. She wrote it to herself, the way her mother had taught her when she was small and afraid of something. Write down what you're afraid of, and then write down what you're made of, and see which list is longer. She wrote for a long time. When she was done, she read both lists through twice. She sat for another moment in the quiet of her room, in the house that had held her for 23 years, and that she understood now, probably leaving, one way or another, before the winter was fully over. She folded the letter. She wasn't afraid anymore. That was the thing she noticed first. Not that the fear had vanished, but that something else had settled in alongside it. Something steadier and quieter and more durable. She'd looked at her own name on that page, and she'd recognized it. She hadn't disappeared inside the fear. She was still there. She was still herself. She blew out the candle and lay down in the dark and listened to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her. The creak of the 3rd stair, the rattle of the window in its frame, the distant clop of a horse on the cobblestones below. She would send a message to Maximilian Kingsley in the morning. She would tell him she was ready to hear the terms. Not because she had surrendered. Not because she had run out of choices, or run out of fight, or run out of any essential part of herself, but because she had looked at the door clearly, without romance and without bitterness, and she had decided, of her own free will, that she would walk through it. And she intended to walk through it on her own 2 feet, with her chin level and her eyes open. And God help the man if he turned out to be something different than what he'd presented in that drawing room. Because Caroline Sinclair had never once in her life gone down without a fight. And she didn't intend to start now. The message she sent him was 7 words long. I am ready to hear the terms. She had written it 4 times before she was satisfied with it. Not because she couldn't find the words, but because she kept adding things and then crossing them out. Conditions, qualifications, the half-formed armor of a woman trying to make herself sound less vulnerable than she was. She crossed all of it out in the end and sent the 7 words, plain and unadorned, because she had decided to begin the way she intended to continue, honestly, without performance. His reply came within the hour, also brief. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock, Kingsley Park. I'll send the carriage. She read it twice, folded it, and put it in her desk drawer. Then she went downstairs and told her father she was going out in the morning, and he looked at her face and understood immediately, and didn't say a single word that wasn't necessary, which was the kindest thing he'd done for her in weeks. She barely slept. She didn't berate herself for it. The carriage arrived at precisely 10 o'clock. She had expected something ostentatious, the kind of display that men with Maximilian Kingsley's money often used as a substitute for character. What arrived was clean and well-kept and entirely without decoration, driven by a man who tipped his hat to her and handed her up without ceremony and didn't speak for the duration of the ride, which she found, unexpectedly, something close to a relief. She used the time to settle herself, to breathe, to remind herself of the 2 lists she had written by candlelight, and the fact that her name had still been legible on both of them when she was done. Kingsley Park was larger than she'd anticipated. She caught her first sight of it through the carriage window, the long drive, the stone facade, the windows that caught the pale winter light and held it. And something moved in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite wonder. It was the thought, this could be my life. Sitting alongside the thought, quiet and honest, I don't know yet whether that's a good thing or a terrible one. He met her himself, not a butler, not a footman. He came down the front steps and opened the carriage door before the driver could manage it, and handed her down with a steadiness that she noticed and filed away. He looked the same as he had in her drawing room, same directness in the eyes, same unhurried quality to his movement. He was wearing a dark coat, no different from what any working man of means would wear, and there was nothing in his manner that suggested he was trying to impress her. "Miss Sinclair," he said. "Mr. Kingsley." She looked up at him without flinching. "You have a great deal of house." "I'm aware." Something crossed his face, that thing adjacent to a smile that she'd seen before. It becomes less impressive when you've lived in it alone for 4 years. She said nothing to that, but she stored it. He led her inside, not to a formal parlor, not to any of the stiff, showcased rooms that wealthy men use to establish the terms of their importance. He led her to a study, warm and plain and full of books and papers, and the comfortable disorder of a room actually used by someone who lived in it. 2 chairs, a fire, a table with a tea service that had already been poured. She sat. He sat. He handed her a cup without asking how she took it, and she noticed he'd gotten it right. Not too strong, no sugar. And she wondered what that meant, and then decided not to wonder too hard about it yet. "I have a document," he said. He reached to the desk beside him and laid it on the table between them. Several pages, dense with careful handwriting. "I had my solicitor draw it up. It lays out what I'm proposing in specific terms, not just the debt settlement, but the structure of the marriage itself. Your allowance, your independence, your right to refuse household decisions you find objectionable." He held her eyes. "Before we discuss anything else, I want you to read it." She looked at the document. Then she looked at him. Most men present a marriage contract to the bride's father. "You're not your father," he said. "You're the one living this." She reached out and picked up the document. She read it, all of it. He didn't speak while she read, didn't shift impatiently or fill the silence with noise. He drank his tea. He let her take her time, and what she found on those pages stopped her breath once, quietly, on the third page. A clause she hadn't expected, written in plain and unambiguous language. In the event that Miss Sinclair finds the union untenable after a period of 1 year, she retains full legal access to a financial settlement and the right to pursue separation without prejudice to her family's cleared debts. She read it twice. Then she put the document down. "You gave me an exit," she said. "I gave you a year to decide what you actually think of me," he said. "Without being trapped." Most men would find that insulting. "Most men," he said evenly, "are more interested in keeping women than in keeping their word." He set down his cup. "I am offering you a real thing, Miss Sinclair, not a cage with a pretty door. If, at the end of a year, you find that I've misrepresented myself, or that you cannot, in good conscience, continue, I want you to have a means of exit that doesn't destroy you. That clause is not a sign of my uncertainty about what I'm offering. It's a sign of my certainty about what I promised you." Caroline set the document down on the table. "You're an unusual man." "So I've been told." "I don't mean it as a compliment yet," she said. "I mean it as an observation." He almost smiled. "Fair enough." She looked at him steadily. "I have conditions of my own." He didn't move, didn't change. "Tell me." "I won't be a decoration," she said. "I won't sit in this house and arrange flowers and wait for you to tell me what to think. If I'm to run this household, I run it. With real authority, not performed authority. I manage the accounts, the staff, the decisions. I won't be overruled in my own domain without a conversation." "Agreed." "I want to continue my correspondence. I write to several women who are involved in education work. There's an effort underway to establish a school in Lower Manhattan for girls who won't otherwise have access to one. I want to continue that work, and I want the freedom to dedicate time and resources to it." Something shifted in his face, something that moved faster than he could quite contain. "Agreed," he said. And then, after a short pause, "I'd like to hear more about that work." She hadn't expected that. She let a beat pass before she continued. "I want my father provided for. Not extravagantly. He doesn't need extravagance, and frankly, it wouldn't improve his character. But I want him comfortable, and I want him to know the house is secure. Not as charity, as a settled matter." "Already in the document," Maximilian said. "Page 5. She blinked. She hadn't gotten to page 5. She picked up the document again, found the clause, and read it. It was exactly as he'd said. Clean, specific, no strings attached. She set the document down a second time. "You thought of that before I asked," she said slowly. "I thought of what a woman in your position would need," he said, "in order to actually say yes to this, without feeling like she'd abandoned someone. The fire popped. Neither of them moved. "Why," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. "Are you doing this?" The real answer. Not the moral argument, and not the practical one. The real one. He was quiet for a moment, longer than before. She watched something move across his face. Not performed emotion, nothing rehearsed. The genuine effort of a private man deciding how far he was willing to open a door. "I have a sister," he said. He said it simply, the way you say a thing that has been true for a long time and has stopped being sharp, but hasn't stopped being heavy. "Younger than me by 6 years. Our father made a poor investment when she was 17, and the family needed capital quickly, and my father, he was not a bad man, he wasn't. But he made a decision about my sister's future without asking her opinion. And the man he made it with was the kind of man who presents well in parlors and behaves differently in private." He stopped. "I was 22. I didn't stop it. I didn't know how. I told myself she'd be all right." His jaw tightened slightly. She wasn't all right. Caroline didn't move, didn't speak. She held the weight of what he'd just given her with the care it deserved. "I've carried that for 14 years, he said. "Not as guilt, exactly. I've made a kind of peace with it that took a long time to arrive at. But it changed what I'm willing to walk past. And when I stood in that hallway at Hargrove's and heard Ashford lay out his terms," he stopped again. He looked at her. "It wasn't you specifically. I want to be honest about that. It was the situation. The fact of a woman's life being arranged around her without her voice in it. I couldn't walk past it." "But you stayed," Caroline said, "after you paid. You didn't just settle the debt and leave. You came here. You drew up that contract." "Yes." "Why?" He held her eyes. "Because when I thought about sending a solicitor," he said, "it felt like doing the same thing, arranging your life around you, without asking." He paused. "And because I found, when I thought about this more carefully, that I wanted to meet you." That landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to land. She felt it, and she didn't look away. "I'm not a romantic," she said carefully. "I know. I don't believe in love at first sight, or destinies, or any of that. I think people make choices, and then they make meaning out of those choices. And the meaning can be real and durable and worth having. But it doesn't arrive like lightning. It builds." "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what I think." "Then we understand each other." "I believe we might," he said. And something in the way he said it, quiet, certain, without a single unnecessary word, made something in her chest go still, in a way it hadn't been still in a very long time. She almost said yes then. She felt it in her throat, the word, ready. And then something stopped her. Not fear, not doubt, but the voice of a woman who had promised herself she would not be rushed by the feeling of being seen. "I need to ask you something," she said. "And I need you to answer it without managing me." "Ask." "What happened with Ashford?" She watched his face. "After you left that room, what did he do?" Maximilian was quiet for a moment. The pause was a fraction too long. "He accepted the money," he said. "The debt is settled." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. He set down his cup. "He called on me 2 days ago," he said, "at my offices." She waited. "He wanted to renegotiate," Maximilian said carefully. "He had concerns about the arrangement." "Meaning he was angry?" meaning he made it clear that he considered himself to have a prior claim on the situation, and that he was displeased by my intervention. Caroline felt something go cold in her stomach. He doesn't give up easily. No, Maximilian said. He doesn't. Does he... Is there something between your families? Some history I should know about? Maximilian looked at her, and in his face she saw it. The thing he'd been deciding whether to tell her, right at the edge of his willingness to open a door. He made a decision. She watched him make it. Ashford and my father did business together, he said, 20 years ago. It ended badly. Not illegally, but badly. There are men in this city who would say that Ashford has reason to consider the Kingsley family a professional enemy. He paused. It's possible that my interest in that room in Hargroves was not entirely unknown to him. It's possible he was setting a stage. She stared at him. You think he wanted you to intervene? I think, Maximilian said slowly, that it's not impossible he engineered the situation knowing that word would reach me, that I would act, that the act itself would put you in my orbit and create complications for me. The silence in the room went very dense. He could be using me, she said. The words felt strange in her mouth, cold and precise. As a weapon against you. It's a possibility I can't rule out, Maximilian said. And I'm telling you this because you asked me not to manage you, and because you deserve to know the full landscape of what you'd be walking into. He held her eyes without flinching. I won't insult you by pretending the world is simpler than it is. Ashford is a man with a long memory and a patient nature, and if he has decided to make trouble, he will find ways to make it. That is the truth of what I can offer you, Miss Sinclair. Not a clean situation, not a simple one, a real one with real complications, and a man who will face those complications honestly instead of hiding them from you until after the vows are said. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her was very quiet, the particular quiet of a woman doing rapid, precise thinking behind a composed face. If he set this up, she said, if he put my father at that table deliberately, knowing you'd intervene, then my father's debt wasn't an accident. No, Maximilian said. It may not have been, her jaw set. He orchestrated it. He used my family. Possibly. Possibly, she repeated. She could hear the thing in her own voice, the hard, bright edge of anger, the kind she'd been keeping carefully banked since the night she'd found the letter behind her father's clock. And he was going to take me as the prize at the end of it. Yes. She stood. She wasn't fleeing. She just needed to be upright. She crossed to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, her hands at her sides. Not because she needed to compose herself, but because she needed to put the full shape of her anger somewhere her face wouldn't give it away before she'd decided what to do with it. Miss Sinclair, don't, she said quietly. Don't apologize. Don't soften it. Just give me a moment. He gave her the moment, full and uninterrupted. When she turned around, her face was steady. Her eyes were very clear. She looked like a woman who had made a decision while she was standing at a window. The kind of decision that has a weight to it. The kind you can hear settle. He used my family, she said. He put my father in a room and stripped him down to nothing and put me on the table like a chip to be collected. She paused. And you walked in and changed the terms. Yes. Not because of me, she said. Not at first. Because of your sister. Yes. But you're here now, she said. Because of me. He looked at her. Yes. She crossed back to her chair. She sat. She picked up the document from the table, squared it neatly, and placed it in her lap with both hands flat on top of it. "I have one more condition," she said. "Tell me." "If Ashford makes a move against this family," she said, "against you, against my father, against me, I want to know about it, immediately. Not protected from it, not managed. I want to know, and I want to be part of how we respond to it." She held his eyes. "I am not a woman who needs to be kept safe from the truth of her own situation. Are we clear on that?" Maximilian Kingsley looked at her across the table, with something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Something unguarded and direct, and, she thought, very close to admiration. "We are clear," he said. She held out her hand, not warmly, not as a romantic gesture, not with any pretense that this was something it wasn't yet. She held it out the way you hand someone a key to something real and serious and worth protecting. "Then I accept," she said. "The terms, the contract, and the complications." He reached across the table and took her hand. His grip was firm and even, and he didn't hold it a moment longer than the handshake required. "I won't make you regret it," he said. "No," she said. "You won't." She looked at him steadily, without softness and without hostility, and without any of the performance that women in her position were supposed to produce. "Because if you try, Mr. Kingsley, I'll make certain you know about it." He looked at her for a beat, and this time, finally, he actually smiled. It changed his face entirely. It made him look less like a man who carried things, and more like a man who, just for a moment, had put something down. It was brief. It was real. It disappeared quickly, the way real things often do. But she'd seen it. She filed it away, carefully, in the place where she was keeping all the things she didn't yet know what to do with. And somewhere underneath the fear and the pride and the cold, clear logic of everything she'd just agreed to, something small and stubborn and not yet ready to be named was beginning, very quietly, to wake up. They were married on a Tuesday. No announcement in the papers, no formal reception, no parade of well-wishers, no ceremony designed to impress anyone who wasn't already in the room. A judge, 2 witnesses, her father standing to her left, with his hands folded and his jaw set at an angle that told her he was holding himself together through sheer determination. Maximilian, to her right, solid and unhurried, saying the words with the same steady quality he brought to everything, present, deliberate, meaning what he said. When the judge pronounced them married, Caroline looked down at her hand. The ring was simple, gold, unadorned. She had told him she didn't want stones, and he had not argued, and the ring he'd placed on her finger was exactly what she'd asked for, and nothing more. She found that she liked it for the same reason she'd liked the carriage he'd sent. No performance. Just the real thing. "Congratulations, Mrs. Kingsley," the judge said. Mrs. Kingsley. She tried the name on the inside of her mind and found it strange and not entirely unpleasant, the way a new coat feels before you've worn it long enough for it to belong to you. Her father embraced her at the door. He held on for a moment longer than she'd expected, his arms around her shoulders, and she could feel him breathing. "Caroline," he said. Just her name, nothing else. She put her hand flat on his back and said, "I'm all right, Papa. I promise." And she meant it as completely as she'd ever meant anything. She and Maximilian rode to Kingsley Park in the same plain carriage that had collected her 2 weeks before. They sat across from each other, and the silence between them was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. It was something more specific than either of those things. It was the silence of 2 people who have just made an enormous and irrevocable decision, and are being honest with themselves about the size of it. Halfway through the ride, without looking up from her hands, she said, Are you nervous? A beat. Yes, he said. She looked up. He was watching her. Something in his face was quieter than usual, less guarded, and she thought it was probably the most honest answer he'd given her yet. Not because the other answers had been dishonest, but because this one had come without any preparation. Good, she said. So am I. He almost smiled. She was beginning to be able to predict when he was going to do that. The slight shift around his eyes, the way his mouth moved before he decided against it. She didn't know what to do with the fact that she'd learned to read him that quickly, so she filed it away with the other things she wasn't ready to examine. The first week at Kingsley Park was an education in the difference between a house and a home. The house was large, well-staffed, and impeccably maintained. The staff was professional and careful, and they addressed her as Mrs. Kingsley from the first morning with a smoothness that suggested Maximilian had prepared them. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Aldrich, small, precise, with the face of someone who has managed difficult situations and survived them all, handed her the household accounts on the second day without being asked, which Caroline took as a sign of either remarkable efficiency or a test. She chose to treat it as the former, and spent 3 hours going through them, and emerged with 4 questions and 2 suggestions. And Mrs. Aldrich received all 6 with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was at least something in the neighborhood of respect. Maximilian worked. He worked constantly. Early mornings in his study, afternoon meetings she wasn't privy to, correspondence that arrived in volumes that suggested a man with too many things happening at once. He was courteous at dinner. He asked about her day with what she gradually understood was genuine interest rather than social obligation. He remembered what she told him. Once, on the 3rd day, she mentioned in passing that she'd been trying to track down a particular pamphlet related to the education work she told him about, and the following morning she found it on the table outside her room, with no note attached. She stood in the hallway holding it for a long moment. Then she went downstairs and found him in the study and put the pamphlet on his desk. "Thank you," she said. He looked up. "Did it help?" "It would have taken me another week to find it." "I know a bookseller," he said, simply. He went back to his correspondence. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was necessary, watching him write, and then she went about her morning. The complications arrived on the 8th day. She was in the small sitting room adjacent to the library, working through a letter to one of her contacts regarding the school project, when she heard voices in the hall. Maximilian's, low and controlled, and another one she didn't immediately place. Sharp, agitated. The particular pitch of a man making a point he feels entitled to make. She set down her pen. The voices moved toward the study, and she heard the study door close, firmly. And then the house went quiet. She stayed where she was for perhaps 3 minutes. Then she put down the letter, rose, and went to the study door. She knocked twice and opened it without waiting. Maximilian was behind his desk. Across from him, standing because he hadn't been invited to sit, was a man she didn't know, perhaps 50, with the look of someone who had once been powerful and currently felt that power slipping and was furious about it. He turned when she came in, and his face rearranged itself from fury into something that was attempting to be charm and wasn't quite making it. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, and looked at Maximilian. "Should I come back?" "No," Maximilian said. He said it immediately, without hesitation, and she understood it was an answer to a question she hadn't explicitly asked. "Mrs. Kingsley, this is Mr. Gerald Forsyth. He handles certain business concerns that overlap with some of mine." He paused. Mr. Forsyth was just leaving. Forsyth looked between them. Something moved in his face, an assessment, rapid and unfriendly. "Congratulations on the marriage," he said. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who does not mean the words he is saying. "I was not aware the Kingsley household was expanding." "It is," Maximilian said. "Good day, Forsyth." A moment, tight, charged, and then Forsyth left. He didn't look at Carolyn again on his way out, which told her more than if he had. When the door closed, she looked at Maximilian. "Who is he?" "A problem," Maximilian said. He sat back in his chair. "A manageable one. He's connected to Ashford, not directly, but through 2 intermediaries, which in business terms is close enough to count." "He came here to deliver a message?" "Yes." "From Ashford?" "Yes." She crossed to the chair across from his desk and sat down. "Tell me." Maximilian looked at her for a moment with the expression she was learning to recognize, the one where he was deciding how much door to open. Then he seemed to remember their conversation at this same desk, her hand extended across the table. "I want to know, and I want to be part of how we respond." He reached into the drawer and put a single sheet of paper on the desk between them. She picked it up and read it. It was brief, typed, not handwritten, which meant it was designed to be untraceable. It said, in the careful language of a man who knew how to threaten without explicitly threatening, that certain business interests connected to the Kingsley name were under review, that certain prior transactions had come to the attention of parties who found them irregular, and that the situation might be resolved quietly if both parties were willing to discuss terms. She set it down. "He's going after your business." "He's attempting to," Maximilian said. "The transactions he's referring to are not irregular. I have documentation for everything. But litigation is expensive and slow, and he knows it. And the implication of impropriety, even an unfounded one, does damage while the case is being made." "He's trying to bankrupt you the same way he bankrupted my father," she said. Maximilian went very still. "Yes," he said slowly. "That's a very precise way to put it." "My father wasn't the first, was he?" she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her. "No." The thing in her stomach hardened into something she recognized. The same hard, bright edge she'd felt in this room 3 weeks ago, when she'd understood the full shape of what Ashford had done. "He does this," she said. "He finds men with weak spots, gambling debts, bad investments, something to leverage, and he sits them down at a table and strips them. And then he takes what he wants from whatever's left." She stopped. "How many?" "That I can confirm." Maximilian opened another drawer, and this time what he put on the desk was a file. Thick, well organized, the product of careful work over considerable time. 7. Over 12 years. Your father was the most recent. He paused. He is not a man who does things once and stops. She stared at the file. Then she picked it up and opened it. Caroline. He used her given name for the first time. He seemed to realize it a half-second after she did. He didn't take it back. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to," she said. She was already reading. "That's not why I'm doing it." She read for 20 minutes. He let her read. When she put the file down, she was very quiet for a long moment, and the quiet was the particular kind that has heat underneath it. "He ruined these people," she said. "Deliberately. Systematically. And then he collected from them." "Yes. And no one has stopped him because he's careful enough to stay legal." "Just barely," Maximilian said. "Just enough that any one instance looks like bad luck rather than predation." "But all 7 together." "All 7 together is a pattern," he said. "That is exactly what it is. And patterns can be demonstrated in court, given the right documentation, and the right argument. He held her eyes. I have been building that documentation for 3 years. Ashford knows it. That's why he's pushing now. He's trying to create enough financial pressure to make it not worth my time to continue. She looked at him across the desk. Something shifted in the room. The particular shift that happens when two people understand simultaneously that they are in something larger than they'd initially agreed to. You were already coming after him, she said. Before my father. Before the card game. Yes. Then Ashford wasn't just targeting my father because of your family history, she said slowly. He was targeting my father to get to you, to destabilize you, to give himself leverage. Yes. He used my family as a weapon to slow you down. Yes. Maximilian's voice was flat and even, but there was something underneath it, something she was starting to be able to hear now, after 8 days of learning to read a man who was careful about what he showed. It wasn't just anger. It was the kind of long, controlled fury that has been carried a long time without being put down. Your sister, she said quietly. He looked at her. She watched something move across his face that he didn't manage in time. Was her husband connected to Ashford? A long pause. The man she married had debts, he said. To Ashford. Debts that were called in, 4 months after the wedding, at a scale that required certain arrangements to be made to settle them. Arrangements that my sister had no voice in. He stopped. I have never been able to prove direct connection. The paper trail is carefully obscured. But you believe it. I believe, he said, that Ashford has been doing this for a very long time, to a great many people, and that he has been very careful to ensure that each instance looks isolated. He paused. And I believe that he made a mistake when he sat my father-in-law down at a card table in a room where word would reach me, because I now have a reason to push harder and faster than I had before. She was quiet. Then she said, What do you need? He blinked, just slightly. I beg your pardon? To build the case, she said. To make the pattern visible. What do you need that you don't currently have? He looked at her across the desk, really looked at her, with the full, unguarded attention of a man who has not had someone ask him that question in a very long time. Testimony, he said, after a moment. From the people he's done this to. Most of them are afraid to speak because he still has leverage on them, or because they're ashamed, or because they don't believe it will make a difference. He paused. Your father is one of 7, Caroline. If even 3 of them were willing to testify to the pattern, I can talk to my father, she said, immediately. Tonight. Something moved in Maximilian's face. You don't have to do that. No, she agreed. I choose to. She stood. You said you were building this case for 3 years. You said you had documentation. She picked up the file and set it back in front of him, squared precisely. Then let's build it faster. He was looking at her with a particular expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not admiration exactly, something deeper than admiration, something that had more weight to it. Something that a man who spent a great deal of time carrying things alone might look like when someone unexpectedly offered to help carry. You were expecting to do this by yourself, she said. It wasn't an accusation. I've done most things by myself, he said, quietly, without self-pity, simply as a fact. That's not a virtue, she said. That's just a habit. His mouth moved. She knew the shape of it now, the almost smile, the thing adjacent. Yes, he said. It is. Then we'll work on that, she said. She left the study and went directly to the sitting room and wrote a letter to her father asking him to come to Kingsley Park the following morning. She didn't explain why in the letter. She knew he would come. Her father would always come when she asked, especially now. Especially carrying the weight of everything that had led to this room. What she didn't expect was the letter waiting for her on the hall table when she came out. She almost missed it. It had been placed face down, and Mrs. Aldrich, who ordinarily would have brought correspondence directly to her, was nowhere in sight. She turned it over and saw her name written in a hand she didn't recognize, and she understood immediately, from the quality of the paper and the particular precision of the letters, that this had not come through the normal post. She opened it standing in the hall. It was from Ashford. Not threatening in the way the typed note to Maximilian had been. Something more careful than that. It addressed her directly. Dear Mrs. Kingsley, if I may be so forward, and it expressed with elaborate courtesy his hope that she was well, and his confidence that her new circumstances were suiting her, and his sincere interest in speaking with her privately, at her convenience, regarding a matter of mutual concern to both their families. And at the very end, in the last line, a single sentence that was doing enormous work beneath its pleasant surface. There are things about your husband's history that a wife deserves to know. She stood in the hall for a long moment. Her heartbeat had gone hard and specific, the way it does when something dangerous is trying to look like something ordinary. Then she folded the letter, put it in her pocket, and went back to the study. She knocked. She entered. She put the letter on the desk in front of Maximilian without a word. He read it. She watched his face while he read. His jaw tightened once, briefly, and then went smooth again. When he looked up, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen there before. Not guilt exactly, but the look of a man who has been anticipating a reckoning and has just seen it begin. What does he mean, she said carefully, about your history? Maximilian set the letter down. He folded his hands. He looked at her with the steady, direct gaze that she had come to associate with the moments when he was deciding to be entirely honest, and she braced herself, without knowing yet what she was bracing for. When I was 26, he said, I made a business decision that I have spent the last 10 years regretting. He paused. It was not illegal. It was not, by the standards of the time, even unusual. But it caused harm to people who couldn't afford to absorb it. And I knew that when I made the decision, and I made it anyway, because I was 26 years old and more interested in winning than in being right. He held her eyes. Ashford knows about it because he was adjacent to the transaction. He has never used it against me directly, because doing so would require admitting his own involvement. But he is willing, apparently, to imply it to you as a way of creating doubt. She looked at him. What people were harmed? He told her. A textile supplier, a small operation, a family business, undercut deliberately by a pricing move Maximilian had orchestrated. They'd closed within the year. He'd looked into their situation 4 years after the fact, when he was older and less interested in winning than in sleeping at night. And he'd found them and compensated them, quietly, without making it a story about his own redemption. Did it make it right? She asked. No, he said. It made it better. It didn't make it right. She was quiet for a moment. She was looking at him, and she was thinking about a woman who had written 2 lists by candlelight, and looked at the one that said what she was made of, and recognized her own name. Everyone has a 26, she said finally. Something they did before they were fully the person they intended to become. He looked at her. I'm not absolving you, she said. I'm noting the fact. She picked up the letter from the desk. Ashford sent this to create distance between us, to make me doubt you. She looked at it. But what it actually tells me is that he's afraid. That the documentation you've been building is close enough to usable that he's changed strategies. She set the letter down. He's not trying to stop you anymore. He's trying to stop me. Maximilian went very still. Explain. He thinks I'm the softer target, she said. He thinks if he puts doubt in my mind about you, I'll… what? Pull back? Refuse to cooperate? Convince you to drop the case? She shook her head slowly. He doesn't know what kind of woman I am. No, Maximilian said. And now the look on his face was entirely unguarded, open in a way she hadn't seen it before, in a way that she suspected very few people had seen it. He doesn't. She picked up the letter one final time, walked to the fireplace, and put it in. She stood and watched it burn until there was nothing left. Write to your solicitor, she said, without turning around. Tell him we're accelerating the timeline. She paused. And tell him we're going to need a meeting with at least 3 of the other 7. I'll work on my father. You work on the rest. She turned around. He was still sitting behind the desk, watching her with that open, unguarded expression that she thought was probably as close as he knew how to get to saying the things that were harder to say than legal strategy and honest histories. Carolyn, he said. Yes. I'm glad, he said, that I walked into that room. She looked at him. He meant it. She could tell by now the difference between the things he said because they were appropriate and the things he said because they were true. This was the second kind. So am I, she said. And the thing she hadn't been ready to name, the small and stubborn thing that had started waking up in a carriage 3 weeks ago and had been getting steadily louder ever since, moved inside her chest like something testing the walls that had been kept behind. She didn't name it yet, but she stopped pretending she couldn't hear it. Edward Sinclair came to Kingsley Park the following morning, looking like a man who had rehearsed what he intended to say and then lost the notes somewhere between the front door and the sitting room. He sat across from his daughter, with his hat in his hands and his jaw working, and she didn't give him the speech he'd prepared for. She gave him something harder. I need you to testify, she said, against Ashford, in court, on record, with your name attached. The hat stopped moving in his hands. Caroline, I know what I'm asking, she said. I know what it costs. I know that your name in a legal proceeding feels like exactly the kind of public humiliation you've spent 30 years trying to avoid. She leaned forward. But Papa, he did this to you deliberately. He sat you down at that table knowing exactly what he was doing. He has done it to 6 other men that we know of, and he has been doing it for 12 years. And every time someone like you stays quiet out of shame, he gets to do it again to someone else's family. Her father stared at her. You know about the others. Maximilian has been building a case for 3 years. He needs testimony to make the pattern visible in court. Without witnesses, all he has is documentation. With them, she stopped. With them, it becomes what it actually is. Systematic. Criminal in intent, even if not in law. Edward was quiet for a long time. His hands had gone still on the hat. He'll come after me, he said. Ashford. If I testify, he'll find something. He always finds something. He already came after you, she said. He sat you at a card table and stripped you down to your last asset and put me on the table as a chip. Her voice was steady and clear. He already did the worst he could to us, Papa. What's left to lose? The silence stretched. She watched her father's face move through something complicated and painful. The way a man's face moves when he is deciding whether he is the person he would like to be, or the person fear has made him. Does Kingsley know you're asking me this? He said finally. It was my idea, she said. "He didn't ask me to." Her father looked at her for a long moment, with something in his eyes that she recognized from childhood. The look he'd had when she'd done something that surprised him into pride, before he'd expected it. "All right," he said quietly. "All right, Caroline. Tell me what I need to do." She reached across and put her hand over his, the same way she had in his study 3 weeks ago, when his hands had been shaking. They weren't shaking now. She squeezed once and let go. "I'll have Maximilian's solicitor contact you tomorrow," she said. "His name is Harrison. He's good." "How do you know he's good?" "Because Maximilian chose him," she said. "And Maximilian doesn't make careless decisions." Her father looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something between relief and the particular quiet of a man who has realized, later than he should have, that his daughter is extraordinary. "No," he said. "I don't suppose he does." Maximilian was in the study when she came back, standing at the window with the letter in his hand and his shoulders carrying a tension she'd learned to read over the past 2 weeks. The particular set that meant something had moved, and not in a direction he'd anticipated. "What happened?" she said. He turned. He held out the letter. "Forsyth has been talking," he said. "He's approached 2 of the other families in the file. He's offering them a settlement from Ashford. A small sum, a release from remaining obligations, in exchange for a written statement that their dealings with Ashford were entirely voluntary and satisfactory." She took the letter, read it fast. "He's buying their silence before we can get to them." "Yes, and he's moving quickly. He must have had this ready, which means he knew we were accelerating." "How did he know?" Maximilian's jaw tightened. "There's someone in Harrison's office who is not as careful with correspondence as they should be." He paused. "Harrison is dealing with it, but the damage may already be done with 2 of the 7. "2," she said. "That leaves 5, including my father." "Your father agreed?" "This morning." Something moved in his face, that open, unguarded quality that kept appearing and kept taking her breath a little. "You didn't tell me you were going to ask him." "I didn't want you to tell me not to," she said, simply. He looked at her. "I wouldn't have told you not to." "I know," she said, "but I wanted to be sure it was done before you had the chance not to." She set the letter on the desk. "We need the remaining 4. How quickly can Harrison arrange meetings?" "A week. Maybe 10 days. "Tell him 5 days," she said. "Caroline." "Ashford is buying time," she said. "Every day we give him is a day he uses. 5 days." She held his eyes. "I'll help. Give me the 2 families he hasn't reached yet. I'll go myself." The silence in the room went taut. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, and she could see him working through the objection and setting it down, the way a man sets something down when he realizes the person in front of him has already accounted for every argument he was about to make. "The Whitmore family," he said, "and a man named Carr in Brooklyn. He's the most recent before your father. Ashford took his warehouse in a trade deal 18 months ago." He paused. "Carr is angry. He doesn't need convincing. He needs a reason to believe it'll work." "Then I'll give him one," she said. She left for Brooklyn the following morning. She went alone, which Maximilian objected to, and she acknowledged the objection and went anyway, which she seemed to accept as the pattern their marriage was establishing. She found Carr, a broad, weathered man in his mid-40s, who answered the door of his modest house with the face of someone who had been waiting for bad news long enough that he'd stopped being surprised by it. She told him who she was. She told him what they had. She put the file on this kitchen table and let him read it, and she sat across from him and didn't rush him and didn't soften it. When he looked up, his eyes were red, not from sadness, from the specific heat of a man who has been waiting 18 months to find out that his misfortune was not stupidity, but predation. "He did this on purpose," Carr said. His voice was rough. "It wasn't bad luck. He planned it." "Yes," she said. "All of it. Yours and 6 others." "And you can prove it?" "With your testimony and the others, yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're Kingsley's wife." "Yes." "Why are you here instead of him?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I know what it is to have your future arranged around you without your voice in it," she said. "And because I thought you might want to hear this from someone who knows that feeling and is here anyway." Carr looked at her for a long beat. Then he nodded. Once, hard. The nod of a man making a decision he's been waiting to make. "Tell me where to sign." The Whitmore meeting was harder. Margaret Whitmore, the widow of the man Ashford had ruined 8 years prior, was 60 years old and had spent the intervening years constructing a careful, quiet life that required her not to think about what had been taken from her. Caroline sat in her parlor and drank her tea and listened to her talk around the subject for 20 minutes, and then, gently and precisely, she stopped letting her. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I know what it costs to revisit this. I know what it means to open a door you closed for very good reasons." She set down her cup. "But Ashford is still doing this, right now, to other families, and you are one of the people who can stop him." Margaret Whitmore looked at her hands. "I'm an old woman," she said. "I don't have—" "You have your name," Caroline said. "That's all we need. Your name, your testimony, and the fact that you were here and it happened to you." She paused. "That's not nothing, Mrs. Whitmore. That's everything." The silence lasted a long time. Then Margaret Whitmore looked up. Her eyes were dry. Her jaw was set. "When do you need it by?" Caroline was back at Kingsley Park by evening. Maximilian was in the study, and Harrison was with him. A compact, serious man in his 50s, who looked up when she came in, with the expression of someone who had been having a difficult afternoon and was reassessing. "Carr and Whitmore," she said. She put their signed statements on the desk. "You have 5, including my father." Harrison picked up the statements and read them rapidly. Something shifted in his face. "5 is enough," he said. Not with excitement, with the quiet certainty of a man who knows what the numbers mean. 5 documented instances with witness testimony establishes the pattern. A pattern is demonstrable intent. Demonstrable intent changes the legal category of what he's done. He looked at Maximilian. "We can move." "How long to file?" Maximilian asked. 2 weeks to prepare. 1 to file." 3 weeks, Maximilian said. "Ashford has had 14 years. We can manage 3 more weeks." Harrison nodded and packed his case and left. And then it was just the 2 of them again in the study, with the fire burning and the light going the particular amber color of early evening in winter. "You got Whitmore," Maximilian said. He was looking at her with the open, unguarded expression. "She needed someone to sit with her for a while first," Caroline said. "That's all. I've been trying to reach her for 2 years." "You sent a solicitor," she said, not unkindly. "She needed a person." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm learning," he said, "that there are a great many things I've been doing by sending solicitors." "Yes," she said, "you are." Something in the room shifted. The particular shift that happens between 2 people when they have been in something hard together and have come through the hard part and are standing on the other side of it, a little surprised to find themselves still standing. a little surprised to find the other person still there. She went to the fireplace. She sat in the chair she'd started thinking of, somewhere in the past 10 days, as hers. He came and sat across from her, and they were quiet for a while, in the way they'd gotten comfortable being quiet. Not the silence of two strangers, not anymore. The silence of two people who had learned each other's weight and found it bearable. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to let me finish before you say anything." "All right." She looked at the fire. "When I was sitting in that drawing room, waiting for you to come, the first time, before I'd met you, I had decided exactly what kind of man you were going to be. I've constructed you entirely from reputation and necessity. And what I'd built was someone I could be in a practical arrangement with, and nothing more." She paused. "I was prepared to be civil and competent and correct, and to honor the terms, and to be very careful not to expect anything that wasn't in the contract." He didn't speak. She'd asked him not to. "You were not what I constructed," she said. "You were considerably more complicated and harder to dismiss. And you kept doing things." She stopped, gathered herself. "The pamphlet, the clause about the exit, the way you told me about your sister, the way you told me about the textile supplier without making it a story about your own goodness." She turned and looked at him directly. "You kept being honest when dishonesty would have been easier. And I kept filing things away in a place I told myself I wasn't going to look at. And I have been running out of room in that place for approximately a week." The fire popped. Neither of them moved. "Maximilian," she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name without the formal prefix, and she felt the weight of it, small and exact, like a key turning. "Yes," he said, quietly, like a man trying not to move and startle something that has finally come close enough to reach. "I am not a romantic," she said. "I meant that when I said it, and I still mean it. I don't believe the feeling arrived like lightning. I think it built, the way I said it builds, out of real things, honesty and difficulty, and the specific texture of watching someone be who they say they are, even when it costs them something." She held his eyes. "But it has built, whatever this is. It has built, and I'm done pretending I don't know what it is." The silence lasted 3 full seconds. She counted. Then he said, "I fell in love with you somewhere between the pamphlet and the fire." She stared at him. "The letter," he clarified. "Ashford's letter. When you burned it without asking my permission, or seeking my approval, or doing anything except making the most practical and correct decision in the room." He paused. "I have never in my life wanted someone to be on my side the way I want this woman to be on my side. And I understood that what I was feeling was not strategic or practical or anything I'd planned for." He looked at her. "I've been carrying it for 10 days. And being very careful not to say it before you were ready to hear it." "That," she said, "is the most you have ever said in a single speech." "Yes," he agreed, "it is." She laughed. It surprised her. The laugh. Short and genuine. The kind that comes up before you can manage it. And it seemed to surprise him too. And then something happened in his face that she had never seen there before. Something warmer and more open than the almost smiles and the unguarded expressions. Something that looked like a man arriving somewhere he hadn't known he was headed. He crossed to her chair and crouched down to her level, and took her face in his hands and kissed her. And it was nothing like a contract, and nothing like a transaction, and nothing like the pragmatic middle ground arrangement she had agreed to 3 weeks ago, in a room with a document on the table between them. It was just honest. Completely and entirely honest. The way everything between them had been from the beginning. And it turned out that was more than enough. When they separated, she kept her eyes closed for a moment. When she opened them, he was still right there, his hands still warm against her face, looking at her with the full and unguarded weight of a man who has finally put something down after carrying it alone for a very long time. "Ashford is going to fight this," she said. "Yes," he said. "It'll be ugly before it's done." "Yes. I want to be in the room when it ends." "You will be," he said. "You have my word." She believed him. She'd learned by now the difference between the words he said because they were appropriate and the words he said because they were promises. And this was the second kind. 3 weeks later, Harrison filed the complaint in the New York Circuit Court. The document was 42 pages long. It named Richard Ashford by name. It described 7 instances, spanning 12 years, of systematic financial predation, documented, witnessed, and presented with a kind of meticulous clarity that left very little room for the defense that any single instance had been the product of bad luck or market conditions. It named Edward Sinclair, James Carr, and Margaret Whitmore by name. It named 4 others. Each of their testimonies said the same essential thing in different voices: that they had been found, assessed, and deliberately targeted; that the vulnerability had been manufactured rather than discovered; and that the man who had done it with full knowledge of the harm it would cause. Ashford's lawyers responded within the week with a countersuit alleging defamation. Maximilian's response to the countersuit was 4 words, delivered through Harrison to Ashford's legal team, with the particular flatness of a man who has been waiting a long time for this conversation. "We look forward to discovery." Discovery was where the case was won. Ashford's financial records, subpoenaed after 3 weeks of litigation over the subpoena itself, contained the kind of careful, coded documentation that a man keeps when he believes no one will ever look at it. Transaction records, correspondence, internal notes that, read in isolation, said very little, and read together with 7 witness testimonies, said everything. The case settled before trial. It settled because Ashford's own lawyers told him it wouldn't hold, and because the men who had backed him financially began, quietly and without announcement, to step away from that backing once the records were public. The settlement terms were sealed, but they were substantial, and they included a consent decree that prohibited Ashford from engaging in the class of financial dealings that had formed the backbone of 12 years of predation. It wasn't a prison sentence. Caroline had been honest with herself about that from the beginning. It probably wasn't going to be. But it was a wall, a real one, with real teeth, built from the testimony of the people he had counted on being too ashamed or too afraid to speak. The day the settlement was signed, Maximilian came home at 4:30 and found Caroline in the sitting room, writing a letter to the women involved in the school project. He stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing himself, and she felt him there. She'd gotten good at that, at feeling when he came into a room, at the particular quality the air took on when he was nearby. She put down her pen. "It's done," she said, not a question. "It's done," he said. She let out a breath, long, slow, the breath she had been holding in some form for 3 weeks, or perhaps for 3 months, or perhaps since a morning when she'd found a letter behind a clock and understood that the floor had gone out from under her family. "How does it feel?" she asked. He came in and sat across from her. He thought about it, really thought, the way he did everything, without rushing. "Like a weight," he said finally, "that I've been carrying long enough that I'd forgotten what it felt like to not have it." "Lighter," she said. "Yes." She looked at him across the room. The man she had married in a ceremony with no flowers and no guests, and a judge who mispronounced her name. The man who had sent a pamphlet and drawn up a contract with an exit clause, and told her the truth about his 26-year-old self without making it a story about his redemption. The man she had spent 4 months learning and being surprised by, and falling quietly, stubbornly, irrevocably in love with. "Maximilian," she said. "Yes." "I want to start on the school," she said, "formally. I want to find a building and hire teachers and open it in the fall." She held his eyes. "I'll need your support. Not your money, your name. The Kingsley name carries weight in this city, and I want to use it for something that matters." "You have it," he said, immediately, without qualification. "All of it? No hesitation?" "You're my wife," he said. "What you build is what this family builds. That's what I signed." He paused. "Besides," he said, "I believe in the work. I've read your letters." At her look, he added, "You leave them on the desk in the sitting room. I don't read your correspondence. I've seen the stacks. I know what you're doing." "And?" "And it's important," he said, simply. "More important than most of what I do with my days. I intend to help." She looked at him. The thing in her chest, the small, stubborn thing that had started waking up in a carriage months ago and had been steadily, quietly, inevitably growing ever since, was not small anymore. It was not quiet. It filled her up to the edges, and she didn't try to contain it. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she'd said her conditions across that contract, directly, without performance, meaning every word. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her the first time she walked into a room, and told him to skip the pleasantries. Like a man seeing something he'd been waiting for, without knowing he was waiting. "I know," he said. And then, because he was a man who had spent most of his life carrying things alone, and was still learning not to, he said the rest of it. "I love you too. I have for a while. I was waiting until you knew." "Until I knew, or until I said it first?" "Both," he admitted. She picked up her pen. "Sit down," she said. "I want your opinion on this letter. The woman I'm writing to knows everyone in Lower Manhattan, and she's skeptical, and I need to convince her in approximately 3 paragraphs." He sat. He took the letter when she handed it to him, and he read it with the careful, concentrated attention he brought to everything. And then he put it back on the desk and pointed to the second paragraph and said, "This sentence is doing too much. Split it." And she looked at where he was pointing, and he was right, and she made the edit. And they sat together in the afternoon light and worked, the way they had been working since the beginning, honestly, without performance, as partners in something real. They had not found love in the way either of them had imagined it once, a long time ago. They had not found it in a ballroom, or a grand declaration, or any of the romanticized shapes that stories like to give it. They had found it in a card room at midnight, and a 7-word message, and a document with an exit clause, and a letter burned in a fireplace, and a trip to Brooklyn, and a pamphlet left on a hallway table with no note attached. They had found it the way real things are found, in the middle of hard, honest, unglamorous work, between 2 people who kept choosing to be truthful when dishonesty would have been easier. And what they had built, this marriage, this partnership, this life that had begun as a transaction and become something that neither one of them had adequate words for, was stronger for every difficulty that had shaped it. Stronger for the fear they had both admitted, stronger for the histories they had both disclosed, stronger for the work they had done together and the enemy they had faced together, and the morning they had both woken up and understood, separately and then together, that the year's exit clause was not something either of them intended to use. Caroline Sinclair Kingsley had walked into the worst year of her life and come out the other side of it with a school to build, a case to win, and a man beside her who had learned, slowly and with some difficulty, that carrying things alone was not a virtue. And she had come out herself, entirely, completely, recognizably herself. That was not a small thing. That was not a quiet thing. That was the only thing, in the end, that had ever actually mattered. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.